Today's episode of the Faith Informing Podcast is our final episode in Season 1. So thank you to everyone who has listened along as we've had amazing conversations about how faith intersects with all different areas of our lives. We've talked about gender and sexuality, gratitude. We've talked about what it means to wrestle with grief and death and loss. We've talked about birding and what C.S. Lewis had to say about what kind of rhetoric you should use. And in our last episode, we have the privilege of welcoming Chaplain Margaret Kibben. Chaplain Margaret Kibben is the 61st Chaplain of the United States House of Representatives. In her distinguished military career, Chaplain Kibben served as the 26th Chief of Chaplains for the U.S. Navy, advising top Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard leaders on matters of religious ministry, and leading a community of 2,500 active and reserve chaplains and religious professionals. Before that, she was the 18th Chaplain of the Marine Corps and Deputy Chief of Chaplains, with prior service spanning from the U.S. Naval Academy to assignments with Marine Corps units worldwide. A native of Warrenton, Pennsylvania, Chaplain Kibben holds a BA from Goucher College, an MDiv and DMin from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a master's degree in national security and strategic studies from the Naval War College. She also served as a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace. After her retirement from active duty, she founded Virtue in Practice, offering moral and ethical advisement for leaders, and consulted for the Department of the Navy's Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office. Her numerous awards include the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star, among others. Chaplain Kibben's exceptional journey from the military to her role in the U.S. House highlights her commitment to supporting leaders in public service with moral and spiritual guidance. And so in today's episode, we are going to hear from Margaret, hear about her own story, how she was called into ministry, and then how she moved into serving soldiers in the Navy. She's going to tell us about what it was like her first week as a chaplain to the United States House of Representatives in 2021 when the insurrection happened on January 6th. We are going to hear so much from Margaret, and I know it's going to be an encouraging episode. So stay tuned for our last episode, I should say, of Season 1. Margaret, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It is great to see you. And I know I've seen you over the years at different family events. I should say that I'm grateful first and foremost because you not only you baptized my wife when she was just but a babe, and then you officiated my in-laws' wedding. And so you've been part of our family in a variety of ways. And so I'm grateful to just be able to have this conversation and hear more about your professional life and your ministry life. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
You're quite welcome. As you reflect on that, it's really fun to see how God has woven that tapestry together over several decades. So it's nice to be at this point in our lives together. And I'm very grateful to be participating in your work.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate it. So I wonder if we could start. I just want to hear a little bit about your upbringing. And one of the ways I ask this is, who were the people and where were the places that most influenced you in kind of that 0 to 18? Like where were you and who was influencing you during those years?
Terrific way to frame that question. I grew up in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, which is on the east side of Pennsylvania, a very historic area. A fellow by the name of William Tennant founded our church, which was called the Church of the Lod College. And the Lod College was established in 1727 in order to raise young men in ministry. That college of the Lod College eventually became the College of New Jersey, which ultimately became Princeton Seminary. So for me, and as a Presbyterian, maybe it was all preordained, but that was the church I grew up in, was Neshaminy Warwick Presbyterian Church. And I had a wonderful church upbringing. We had a marvelous youth group. We would get youth pastors straight from Princeton Seminary, recent graduates who were looking for their first job, and they were taken on as assistant pastors, later as associates. And so they were always the ones who were in charge of the youth group. We had a very vibrant bunch of kids. We had a traveling choir, church choir. We had youth group evenings, all sorts of wonderful events, 3 times a week. So that's the environment I grew up in. My parents very active in the church. My dad was a school teacher, but then he was also the Christian education director for the church. My mom sang in the choir, so we were always there at the church. So you talk about a location, it is the church, right there on the Neshaminy Creek. But it was then, as I was very active in the church, as I said, and we'd go on youth retreats. And I remember going on a retreat. We had a marvelous youth pastor then, a guy by the name of Blair Money. He was our associate pastor. And then he took us on a retreat, and we're sitting around a campfire. And I was the kid that all the other kids told their problems to. It was always this sort of, I don't know how I ended up. Maybe I was a good listener. Maybe I was empathetic. I don't know what the deal was, but I heard a lot of people's problems. And as I am thinking about that and who I am as a person, and I look across the campfire, and I look at Blair Money and I say, I want to do what he's doing. And it was a clear call, and I was 14. So I sort of chewed on that. Who has a call at 14? And we had a career paper we had to write in the next year in 9th grade, and everybody's writing, they want to be doctors, they want to be lawyers, they want to be, trash collectors. And I wrote mine on, I want to be a minister. And, where do you go in that day and age? Because I'm no spring chicken here. We went to the encyclopedia for our information. And sure enough, there was a section on ministers, and all the pictures were of guys in robes. So I photocopied the pictures, and they ended up in the front cover of my paper, and said, this is what I want to do. Now, I share that to also add that nobody ever said I couldn't. Now, in the Presbyterian Church, they had been ordaining women for probably at that point, maybe 15 years. So it was relatively new in the church. And I didn't know any female pastors at the time. But I never thought that it made a difference. So to the credit of my congregation, of my parents, certainly, and any youth group leaders I had or church camp I ever went to and said, I want to be a pastor, nobody ever said I couldn't. Now, I know my parents well enough to know that if I had said I want to be a garbage collector, all they would have said is be the best garbage collector you can be. If they knew that was what I felt called to, they were not going to get in the way. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of environment I grew up in, and I think that's really important. Talk about planting seeds and how they're nurtured. That's the nurturing I received. So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to comment. That's incredible to hear that you were in an environment as a young girl, really, that they were not putting any roadblocks in the way of you thinking about a career as a pastor. That's one thing I think about a lot with, for many people who grew up in churches where women were not ordained, for a lot of women, for a lot of young girls, the thought of becoming a pastor wasn't even on the radar because it wasn't really an option. And I think of when I was a kid, I was like, it was always on the radar of like, oh, you could be a pastor, Travis, because I'm seeing guys like me up there preaching. But I just imagine as more and more spaces become, ready and willing to ordain women, how many more 14-year-old girls will feel that call. And I just think that's incredible that that's also incredibly young for anyone to feel a call into ministry. So what was it about? Was there something about that youth pastor? Like, what were some of his characteristics that you found were compelling that made you want to do what he was doing?
Well, for one, he was a genuinely nice guy. And does that necessarily mean all pastors are genuinely nice people? No, not necessarily. But he was a genuinely nice, approachable, pastoral guy. And as I said, I was the kid that was hearing everybody else's story. Well, when I looked at him, I realized that's what he was doing. And he did it in such a way that was gentle and gracious and welcoming. And I thought, well, if I am to be the person who listens, pastor or not, I want to be the kind of person he is. I want to be that representation of the transcendent presence of Christ in the room. And so I knew as a Christian that I wanted to be like him. But then when I realized that there was a vocation, it was so simultaneous, it's almost hard to see. But for me, it meant in my Christian walk, I knew I needed to walk toward ministry.
So where did that lead you as you thought about college, as you were, finishing up high school? What happened next?
So I'm in high school, and I had taken a bunch of courses that enabled me to be finished really with my credits for high school. I could have graduated early, but they had a vocational technical program. It was mostly meant for vo-tech students who were learning things like welding and auto repair and that sort of thing. And they would give them courses at the main high school in the morning, and then they had all afternoon to go to the vo-tech school or to practice their trade. And I appealed to the administration and said, okay, I have all the credits I need. Can I do the same thing, but can I go to my church? And can I help my youth pastor out? So I think it was 3 times a week. I would drive to the church, and I'd spend the afternoon with him. And what was interesting about that, it's the backside of ministry, right? It's not just the front facing thing that you see in the pulpit, but what I saw was a lot of certainly the preparation, but I saw the minutia, the administrivia, if you will. But I also noticed that he wasn't with the congregation all the time. And, as much, he'd go visit people, shut-ins, and, people who were in the hospital and all of that. And I did all of that with him. But I realized that there was something missing from my appreciation of ministry, and that was to be with my parishioners every day. There was something about that. So that started to ruminate, to generate, to germinate in my vocational discernment. Let me give you some background. My dad had served in World War II. He'd been in the World War II. He'd served both campaigns, the Pacific and the Atlantic campaign. And he stayed in the reserves after the war was over. We got his commission. And so I'd see him in uniform about once a month, when he'd go do his reserve drill. And I thought that was really cool. But then in my youth group, I met a young man he was a year ahead of me. He went off to the Naval Academy. And this was the guy, right? This is, my first love. And we were talking, as one does at 17, about the possibilities of the future. So he goes off to plebe summer in Annapolis, and I go with his family to the parents' weekend at the end of plebe summer. And I looked around the academy grounds, and for those of you who haven't been to Annapolis, it's breathtaking. There's so much to it, and the chapel itself is iconic. And as I was walking around what they call the yard or the campus, I said, man, I really like this Navy thing. How could I be in the Navy and be a pastor? And then we went to chapel, and I said, oh, I could be in the Navy and be a pastor as a chaplain. And so there by the banks of the Severn, I had a sense of call to ministry in the chaplain corps at 17. So then I immediately ran to the recruiter and said, I want to be a Navy chaplain. Well, thank heaven it was a good recruiter, and he didn't just sign me up right there and put me on some ship to scrape paint and scrub decks. But he says, in order to be a chaplain, you actually have to have gone to college. And you also have to be matriculated into a seminary before I can even take you into the chaplain candidate program. So I put that vision on my shelf and looked at it every day and went off to college, and then eventually to seminary and did exactly that, joined the chaplain candidate program.
And is that a difficult process? Like when after you've done your seminary training, like for chaplains joining the Navy, are you going to boot camp? Like, what's that like?
Well, there are several avenues to come onto active duty. One is through the chaplain candidate program, which is while you're still in seminary. So yes, I went to the chaplain school in the summer between my first and second year at seminary. And it's not quite a boot camp because you actually already have your commission, so they can't abuse you quite the same way they do some poor soul who just came out from civilian world. There's an expectation that they're going to give you some modicum amount of respect. But we were drilling on the drill field in suit coats and dresses until we were fitted for our uniforms. So there was some, military exercises and indoctrination, but then there was also coursework in terms of what does it mean to serve as a chaplain in an institution. So was it grueling? No. Was it overwhelming? Yes, to some extent, because it was like opening the door to a whole new world. That sounds trite, but it really was. It was an experience I had no idea even existed on the other side of that commissioning document. And so did that during seminary. Now, other chaplains may already be a chaplain, a pastor, I mean, just as you are, Travis, and not that I'm recruiting you, but I might, is that they're already established in a church. And they could actually say, I have a sense of call to military chaplaincy too, and they might actually sign up for the reserves. Or they could say, okay, I've done my time in the sanctuary, in the congregation, I'd like to now join. And so they come on and they go through the chaplain school just as I had done. Both of them, both reserve and active candidates, if you will, come through. And then they come on active duty or reserves.
One thing that strikes me as you're sharing that story is the particular nature of the call. Like you had this call when you were 14 to ministry in general, like I want to be a pastor. But then later on, being at the academy and then seeing the Navy, you're like, no, I want to be a pastor in particular. And I think that's such an important part of it. And that goes, of course, for many vocations. You have to come from the general and focus in. And when you have that call, when you feel like, no, these are my people and this is what I want to do, that gives you a real sense of focus. So when you went into the Navy and joined as a chaplain, was it all that you expected it to be, or were there some surprises? What was it like? Because you had seen life as a pastor in the church when you were younger. But now you were really with these people every day, with these soldiers. And what was that experience like?
So coming on active duty, certainly I did sort of on-the-job training while I was still in seminary because that's how they've framed the chaplain candidate program. So I had a dose of it. The eye-opening part was it is exactly what I thought it would be in the sense that you're walking with people. I often said you would eat, sleep, breathe, and endure the same things your parishioners are eating, sleeping, breathing, and enduring. Every day you have the same routine overall, obviously specifically to your job, where the variance comes. But it getting to know people on Monday through Saturday and not in a prescribed session meeting or a committee meeting, but to see what made them take hours of the day so that I would appreciate better what they brought to church with them on Sunday, or in some cases, Saturdays and Fridays, to see kind of how they lived their life in faith or not in faith, how faith informed them. And so that really helped me to appreciate better the gospel, honestly, in terms of, you think about Jesus, he was with his parishioners every day, and to appreciate how Christ was using common elements to explain the kingdom of God. I would find myself, obviously not to the same extent, but using common elements that were, common to our daily experience to say, and this is how God works, or this is how God is present in this moment, if our eyes are open to it. And for me, that was, it was really the culmination of, or the focus of what I thought I was going toward. Obviously, that wasn't every day, and it wasn't clear every day, but that I did feel, yep, this is what I thought it would be.
That's amazing. I really do think that idea of, the thinking about the story of Jesus and how he really was with his parishioners every day. the story, when I think about that idea, it often comes to mind is um, Jesus. I forget where in the Gospels this is. Of course, I'm forgetting now. It might be Luke 17, but it's when he meets the 10 lepers.
Hmm.
Um, and it's like Jesus was moving in a way with people that he never let. I mean, obviously, at that point, he's going towards the cross. So I always think he's on the mission of a lifetime, and it's like, couldn't have a bigger goal than that. And yet he's walking past these 10 men with leprosy, and they call out to him, and he slows down and he meets them where they're at, and he brings healing. And that story always strikes me as like, would I as a pastor do that today? Would pastors in our American culture do that today, where we have all of our missions that we're, goals that we're trying to accomplish? Um, and sometimes it's easy, we miss the real point, which is the people. Um,
Hmm.
it reminds me of what Eugene Peterson would always say, as pastors can become shopkeepers and they forget
Mm.
what their real role is in people's lives. Um, so, I think of the metaphors Jesus used. He was always using metaphors like seeds and planting and different agricultural metaphors. When you were, with your people, the soldiers, all these military folks, what kind of metaphors were you using?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I'm not sure I can come up with anything specific. I think
Yeah.
it was more just the idea that, you know, they're going on a hike at 6 o'clock in the morning, so am I.
Hmm.
You're carrying a pack, so am I. And yet that doesn't keep us from having the ability to have a conversation about something that has nothing to do with those packs.
Hmm.
Um, I have a fun story I love to tell, and I promise not to swear, but but swearing is integral to the story.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was with a unit of Marines, and we were getting ready to go on a hike, and it's dark. And they're all lined up, and what chaplains do is they show up, and they have, it's kind of, you just sort of chat with people along the way, and of course they're all lined up. So I'm actually working the line, and the benign things that we say. How are you doing today? It's a great day for a hike. You got anything in that pack? Or have I met you before? That kind of stuff. And so I'm walking my way down the line, and I've had a conversation. One was a little awkward, but I didn't really think about it. And then the next guy was pretty together, and I'm on guy number 3, and guy number 1 says, "Who the was that?" Insert swear word. And
Yes.
and then the second guy says, "That was the chaplain." The first guy goes, "Oh," expletive. And then I look back at guy number 1 and I say, "Gotcha." So that's actually part 1 of the story. Then part 2 of the story is we actually step off onto the hike, and we're going 2 by 2. Don't read too much into that. We're going 2 by 2, and I'm up at the front with the commanding officer. Now, units like that have a long pole with a pennant on the end, and it's called a guide on. So in other words, it's raised high so people could guide on it to know where they're headed. So what's really motivating is that a Marine will grab the guide on and will run around the entire formation. It's everybody gets a kick out of it. It's usually
Hmm.
the characters in the unit who will do this. Well, guess what? Let's call guy number 1 Lance Corporal Smith. So Lance Corporal Smith comes around my right flank, and he's got the guide on. And as he comes around to finish, I said, "Hey, Smith, one more time round for penance." So that's haha. Everybody gets a kick out of that. That's part 2 of the story. Then part 3 of the story is that we spent all day together, the whole unit. We spent all day together. They were doing weapons qualifications. They had some exercises they needed to do to kind of train for certain events that unit was being prepared for. And so we're there all day, and I'm there with them all day. And as the night draws nigh, and I go around the camp, and I'm like, "Hey, how are you? How was your day? Did you qualify? How'd you do on that hike? Did you feel pretty good? All that stuff." And who comes along my right flank but Lance Corporal Smith, who says, "Hey, chaplain, you got a minute?"
Hmm.
And then out came his life story. And for me, that is quintessential chaplaincy.
Hmm.
You have no idea why you're up at 6 o'clock in the morning humping a pack. There's nothing theological about this evolution. It's fellowship, it's communal, it's building, relationships. And really that's what it is. It's building relationships with someone who in their eyes shouldn't necessarily have to be there like they are. I mean, they are the fighters. They're the ones who have to qualify in the weapons. And why is this chaplain out here? And yet to have that kind of give and take and that rapport and that, those moments together enabled Lance Corporal Smith to see in the chaplain something that he knew he needed and knew that I was bringing something different into that experience. And so he touched that. And so for me, it's not necessarily a metaphor, but I think it is an example of how I view chaplaincy and what it was for me to be one. I am to be one.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. I'm really struck by that. What you said, it's like you don't know why you're getting up at 6 a.m. And I think this is, something that applies to chaplains, to pastors, but to all Christians. You're not always sure why you're spending time with someone. You're like, I'm supposed to be loving them, loving my neighbor, so maybe this is part of that. But then you're never sure what God is going to do with it. And wow, just opening the door to letting him share his story, it makes me think of like, those guys, they're military. That's their life. They're like eat, drink, sleep, military. And then you're there. Yeah, it's like, why is the chaplain here? But you're saying, but you're not, your whole existence is not military. There's more to you, and I'm here to open
and
the door to that.
why wouldn't I be here with you? Especially if I represent the divine. Why would we circumscribe the divine out of our daily lives?
So how did that, for you as a Christian chaplain, what was it like how did you serve and minister to people of different faiths? What were like, and I know you've taught a lot of other chaplains by this point in your career. Like, what are some of the things you say to chaplains to help them work in kind of a multi-faith setting?
So it's a wonderful question. And honestly, as chaplains are being recruited, that's where the education starts. It's once they've got the uniform on, they better get it by then. But it is a pluralistic environment, and it is one that does require the chaplain to be aware of the multi-faiths and the lack of faith that comes into a command. And so we'd broken it down into sort of 4 requirements or 4 elements of our job description. One is to provide for our own. So for the handful of Presbyterians that were in a command, and I would speak, I could speak the secret squirrel language of Presbyterian. You think about that maybe beyond the Presbyterian world, but if I were a Catholic chaplain, the rites and sacraments, to make sure that those are available to those sailors, Marines, soldiers, airmen, Coast Guardsmen who are Catholic, you would want to make sure that they had access to someone who represents their faith tradition. That's to provide. But I'm not Catholic. And so the other part of my job description is to facilitate. So if I know you are Catholic, it is on me as your chaplain to make sure that you have access to a chaplain who is of your faith tradition, or if not a chaplain, then somebody in the community where the base is or where you're deployed to ensure that there are opportunities for you to worship in accordance with your tradition. And why is this? It's because the Constitution has framed this in such a way that because of our commitment to religious freedom, we don't expect, Travis to leave home and leave his faith behind. We want, when Travis puts a uniform on, he shouldn't have to give God up or his understanding of faith or what it means for him to be something other than just a Marine, a sailor, a soldier. You should know that you are more than that as a person, just as you described that. They aren't just military, they're human beings. So what makes up your humanity? Well, it's your spiritual journey. So it is incumbent on the government, who is in itself has not established religion, to ensure that you have the access and the opportunity to exercise your faith in accordance with the Constitution, which you are in fact defending and supporting. So that is part and parcel of our responsibilities. Now, so provide and facilitate, and the third is to care. So to care for all, and it may not be a religious sort of pastoral care experience. You may be not able to make your bills, and I have access to the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society funds or counselors, and I can get you directed to a number of those resources. Could be Red Cross. It could be, I mean, those are the big ticket items, but it might be just something that you're a sailor, I'll take you off the table, a sailor, a Marine is wrestling with, and they can't put words to it, but it's too close to their heart, to their soul, to reveal it to anyone else. And the chaplain has complete confidentiality. You can say anything to the chaplain. And it's in some ways it's sort of the penitent thing. If I have sinned, I need to go somewhere for repentance, and that's what the chaplain stands for. But in military services, you can actually talk about things that you haven't done yet, are considering doing, and it stays with the chaplain, which is a fascinating place to be, to have that area of sanctuary, of safety. You need that. It's kind of like the valve on a pressure cooker. There's so much going on in a service person's life that the pressure cooker just gets, more and more pressurized, that you need something somewhere to just take that little valve up. And something constructive like a chaplain certainly is a lot better than the many unconstructive things one can do.
So as a chaplain, you were not required to make reports to like a higher officer about what your conversations were with sailors or soldiers. Like that was all confidential between you and them.
That's right. Completely confidential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, that's amazing that they have that space.
Oh, it's brilliant. I just did a retirement for a friend of mine who, on his very first assignment, his tour of duty, he was a brand new chaplain. He'd been a pastor for 4 years. He came on board a cruiser. He has to actually meet the ship on deployment. So he's far away from home, plunked down into the middle of the Mediterranean onto this tiny little boat. And he becomes their chaplain. Well, the ship 4 months later comes into pier and is there at its home port, and a computer goes missing. And they scour the ship. They look all over the ship for this computer, and just bring it forward. Nobody's coming forward with this stolen computer. And this chaplain was there on board late that night, and a sailor came up to him and said, "Chaplain, is everything I tell you confidential?" And he says, "Yep, sure is." And he says, "Well, I have something I need to give you." And the chaplain says, "I'll tell you what, why don't we leave the ship? Why don't we go to the chapel? So there's no chance that anybody's going to see our conversation." And so they go meet at the local chapel. And sure enough, this guy hands the chaplain a computer. Now the chaplain has to make his way back to the ship with this computer in hand. And the executive officer, who's the second in command on the ship, is walking away from the ship. He sees the chaplain, jokes and says, "Chaplain, you're going the wrong direction, blah, blah." And the chaplain says, "Well, that may be, but I have something you've been looking for." And the executive officer, XO is what they call him, the XO says, "Oh, well, who gave it to you? You got to tell me." And the chaplain says, "No, I don't got to tell you. But here's your computer." Well, the group of officers eat in an area called the wardroom, and then the group of officers is also called the wardroom. So all the officers on the ship are in the wardroom debating whether or not the chaplain should tell or not tell. And they're almost divided in half as to, he must tell. He's an officer in the Navy, and this is his responsibility, and this was damaging the reputation of the ship, and blah, blah, blah. And the other saying, no, he's the chaplain. He's the one place that everybody should be able to go to. He's, we need to keep that sacred. And this whole debate is going forward. Well, finally, the captain of the ship, the skipper, says, I disagree with you, but I think it's the right thing.
Mm.
And honestly, I want all my officers to have integrity like his.
Mm.
And so therefore, I am not going to ask him to reveal this. Well, there's another part to this story too. The sailor worked in the wardroom.
Oh,
So he heard this whole debate
he's standing there.
the whole time. And, all because of him, the chaplain is on the hot seat. But imagine the impact that that had on that young man. That here's a man who is willing to stand for him,
Mm-hmm.
who is willing to bear the brunt of his sin, if you will, his theft, bear the brunt of that, and does so that that individual can go free.
Wow. That sounds like he's modeling Jesus Christ. That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
Well, Margaret, we have a little bit left in our time, and I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more about what you're doing today. So now you've had a career in the military, and now you're working with politicians in many ways in the House of Representatives, which is I think of that as adjacently connected, but they're not exactly the same things. So I want to go back to your first week. I remember when you were affirmed and voted in as the chaplain of the House of Representatives, and then just a few short days later, January 6th happened in 2021. So where were you when this was all happening?
Great question. Let me back it up just a little bit and say, you
Sure.
thought that they're sort of adjacent. I think they are anathema to each other.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
For 35 years, I served in the military, and I never got involved in politics. I didn't follow politics. I don't like politics. I still don't like politics. I just had nothing to do with politicians because you followed orders. Your superior officer, unless they tell you to break confidentiality, you follow the orders of your seniors. So to be appointed to this job, it was a decision that was made on my behalf. I didn't apply for it. I was asked if I would apply, put my name in, and a bipartisan group of members of representatives interviewed 5 people, and my name was the one that went forward. So yes, to your point, on January 3rd, that was my day of swearing in, and January 6th was my 3rd day on the job. And I was smack dab in the middle of it. Because what I had learned about chaplaincy is that one has to know the institution. And that's exactly what I knew as a 17-year-old. To be in and with my congregation is to understand, to eat, sleep, breathe, and endure, and understand the machinations, the culture of the institution. So on January 6th, because they were going through the Electoral College, it was a joint session. Well, obviously I've never been in the building anyway. And a joint session is like the ultimate moment on the Hill. Usually you see it with respect to the State of the Union addresses and so forth. Those are joint sessions when the Senate comes from their chamber and they march across the rotunda and statuary hall, and then they find themselves into the House chambers and they file in. And I was right on the aisle in the middle of the room, in the middle of the chambers, because that's where I sit at church, and that's, I can get a good view. So I saw everybody come through, and I saw the senators come through. I saw the electoral boxes come through. I saw the vice president come through. And so I'm right there in the room. It's they start the votes on the different states, and they get to the first contentious state, which was Arizona. And at that point, then the chambers have to separate and do the debates in their own respective chamber. And so the Senate leaves, the parade goes backwards, and I remained on the House side while the debates began. And then it was at that point that the speaker was spirited away by her detail, her protective detail. Then the minority leader and then the majority leader were both sort of taken away. And prior military, my little spidey sense says, security details don't do that for nothing. I've seen that in different environments, and that does not bode well. Well, sure enough, then a Capitol policeman stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, there's been an incursion," and proceeds to tell us what we should be doing. Now, let me back up a little bit to say the legislative day had actually started several hours earlier, so I had already prayed officially. That's what the chaplain does. We open every legislative day in prayer. That's been taking place since 1789 in both the Senate and the House. And I had done my morning prayer already. Well, when the Capitol Policeman spoke, and then there was a great flurry of activity happening, one of the clerks on the floor looked up at me and pointed at me and curled his hand, toward himself, like, "Come down here," that motion. And I came down the aisle, and he said, and, he wanted me to pray. So I got back on the rostrum and I prayed an extemporaneous prayer in that moment. Now, the reactions to that, and immediately don't really know what people have reacted, but as time went past, the reactions I heard were essentially twofold. It was sort of like, "Oh, it's all going to be okay. The chaplain's praying. God is with us. Peace will, preside." The other half of the group assumed that this was like the sinking of the Titanic, and the last thing to do is the priest is offering last rites. So that was sort of the opening moments of January 6th.
That reminds me of a chaplain friend of mine. She was a hospital chaplain. And when she would walk into the room, she'd be like, "Don't worry, no one's dying." Like, exactly. I'm not here for that.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, wow. So such an intense moment. And it's, you've been active duty military in combat zones before. So was a lot of that training kicking in that moment, just how intense it was?
Absolutely. So, again, I go back to my Presbyterian roots, and I do feel like God has prepared me for certain moments in my life. And, you don't know why you're going through what you're going through until it all kind of the focus all sort of zeroes in and the aperture narrows. And then you go, "Oh, that's why I went through that before." All of that happened when I was in combat, and certainly happened on January 6th. I knew what to do. I didn't know these people, but I knew what to do in crisis. I knew what to do in mass casualties were they to happen. I knew how to maintain my cool and to look for people who were not maintaining theirs, and just kind of zero in on them. Interestingly enough, it became very clear to me. We were actually evacuated from the chambers, and it came very clear to me which members were prior military, because they stayed to secure the doors, and to make sure nobody barged into the chamber. And I thought, "Oh, these are my people. I should stay with them, right? I know what they're doing, and I'm their chaplain, and this is the front line, and I should be here." And then I realized, in fact, nobody wanted me there, but I followed the larger group to an undisclosed location. And later I described that like, you talk about the 99 sheep and the one. I wanted to stay with the one, but it was actually the 99 sheep who needed more tending to than the 1%. So
the one was the person who knew what they were doing. The 99 were all freaking out.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. So what does, as we finish up, obviously that was a very unique day in your career, and over your time serving the House. What does a more average day look like for you?
It's funny. There are sort of, I guess, average days, if you will. But again, I open the house in prayer. That is the long pole in the tent, as I call it. If everything is organized around the opening prayer. And so I offer a prayer every legislative day, and it's a different one. I write a prayer every day. I base it in scripture. Long story short, but I realized that would be the best way to kind of ensure that I was not just going off on left field or right field, depending on which party was listening, that I could be faithful to this calling. And so I use scripture. Sometimes I quote it. Sometimes I just use it to frame my thoughts or my organization of my prayer. But every prayer is based in scripture, and it's about 1.5 minutes. And then the rest of the day is left to whatever brings my way. But there is a second pole in the tent, and that's when they're voting. I had hoped that, like in military service, I could be anywhere at any time and talk to them at various less intense moments, have a cup of coffee with them, walk into their offices. It's too hard here. Their schedules are so uh, tight that there's no time for being just casual during the day, except when they come into the chamber and they are there for a long series of votes. And then it's like, I liken it to coffee hour at church. They're there, they put their vote in, they're keeping an eye on when the next vote is due. But other than that, they might be whipping votes. They might be kind of getting somebody to sign on to a bill with them, but oftentimes they're just kind of passing the time. And so I walk around the room and how you doing? How's that pack? Did you qualify today? All those things that chaplains do. And that has created relationships. That's taken a while. They've had to learn to trust me, to know that I am not partisan. I'm not encouraging them or discouraging them from voting one way or the other. I'm not chastising them. There may be a prophetic element to some of my prayers, but it isn't meant to poke them in the chest. It's really meant to show a sense of God's divine justice, love, wrapped in love. But it's taken some time, but now many of those coffee hour conversations have become, I understand you have surgery coming up, or how can I pray for you? Or, hey, chaplain, do you have a minute moments?
That's amazing. I mean, that's really meeting people where they're at. I think that's always what stands out to me as the call of the chaplain is meeting people where they are at. And to be sensitive enough to know when and where to do that is, I just think, a characteristic of true pastoral wisdom. Like that, it's like not your agenda. Like you're like, I'm not gonna come and barge into your office and make this happen. But it's really trusting in the different limited spaces that God gives us to work with people, to get to know people. It's like trusting that that's enough. And like you said, it can take a long time that way because it's not as fast as other ways. But it strikes me you're working at the speed of what people really need there. Um, Wow. Well, it's been just awesome to hear more of your story, Margaret, and just to be able to hear about your ministry both in the past and presently. I know you've had just a massive influence on a lot of chaplains throughout our country and that are serving around the world. And to be able to have an influence for good amongst the politicians that we vote for. And we're recording this episode on November 5th, which is, of course, election day. And in our country right now, there's, of course, a lot of anxiety around election, a lot of fear from both sides of the aisle and everywhere in between. And when you're working with politicians and they're, dealing with the fear or anxiety that comes with the polarization that's been happening in our country for not many years now, um, what might be a word of encouragement, I guess, from your perspective, in the time we're in?
I often say to members, I love you all.
Mm,
I don't have to like you.
mm,
I don't have to. I don't have to agree with what they say. I can be vehemently opposed to what they say, but I have to love them. And it's not just because I wear a collar. It's not just because I'm their chaplain. I have to love them because I represent Christ. As a Christian, I represent Christ. And Christ loved even those who betrayed him. So the encouraging word is that proved to overcome anything that seeks to separate us from what is good and right and perfect. It's that not loving, but that God is love, and therefore nothing can separate us from that love, and we should not be the ones standing in the way of it.
mm. That is a good word. Yeah, to not stand in the way of love, because love, yeah, it's like a flood that wants to come out, but sometimes we're the dam that's holding it back.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Well, thank you, Margaret. Really appreciate that. I think that's a great word to close on. So thanks again for being on the podcast today. I'm grateful for how Margaret ended our conversation today with a focus on love. Love is a difficult virtue to practice, especially when you're dealing with people you just find so frustrating. We had the election a couple of weeks ago now, and so whether you were filled with joy or disappointed or angry or however you responded to the election results, my prayer for you is that you would continue to follow Jesus in the way of love, which means loving those who don't necessarily think the same way as you. Loving people who may even be your brothers and sisters in Christ who are on the other side of the aisle. Trying to embody that posture that Chaplain Kibben has, where she seeks to meet people where they are at and extend that grace and love. So until next season, I wish you well, and I look forward to future conversations. Until then, take good care.